What does it take to make workshops work? And how can we facilitate collaboration that sticks and leads to results? My name is Miriam Happness, and with the Workshops Work podcast, I'm on the mission to find the magic ingredients that make workshops work. Today with me on the show is Mark Walsh, and we speak about embodiment, about the body, how to embody ourselves, meaning how can we find our confidence and courage to show up as ourselves, and how can we help groups to show up? What are the small or big interventions that would work with for everyone? We also speak about concepts like holding space and safe space and energy, and demystify some of the concepts to break it down on what it actually means. So it's a episode full of golden nuggets, lots of learnings, and lots of practical tips on how to bring our bodies back to work. So stay tuned. And by the way, if you don't have pen and paper at hand to take your own notes, scroll down to the show notes to download my free one-page summary. And now, enjoy the show. Hi, Mark. Welcome to the show.
Good to be here.
Thank you for joining me. The embodiment guru. I'm very excited.
Not about guru, but it's going to create the wrong image. I'm more an anti-guru, but certainly experienced teacher.
That's wonderful. And more and more facilitators on the show are speaking about embodiment and bringing the body back to work and to the work. And so it's definitely time to talk to someone who understands what embodiment is.
Yeah, I don't think anyone understands it, but it's certainly been my work for a while. And I'm probably one of the people responsible for spreading the idea in modern circles.
Yeah, wonderful work you're doing. It's so much great stuff. And I always start with the same question.
Yeah.
When did you start calling yourself a facilitator? And actually, do you?
Yeah. I like the word. There's a lot of sort of pretentious alternatives, like learning synergizer or something, Mostly I call myself a teacher. I'm from a family of teachers. My grandmother was a driving instructor. My mum and dad were teachers of different kinds. So that's really my own lineage. I've taught many things, embodiment being the main one in my adult life. So I guess I was probably born into being a teacher. I was helping my parents while still a kid when they used to do youth camps and things. And then, even within a year of, say, learning, starting aikido, I was helping to teach a class or the kids' class. And I guess maybe when I started, nearly 20 years ago, I started my more embodied coach and training business. So that's probably the time I would have first used the word. Though these days I usually say teacher, coach, sometimes facilitator. I think it's a nice word. So yeah, something like that.
Beautiful. And I heard you mentioning aikido. Was this your first introduction to embodiment?
Yeah, pretty bright cognitively as a kid, and I kind of read all the books in the library at high school in Cambridge. And then I was sort of miserable, suicidal, drug addicted alcoholic as a teenager. So I sort of quickly realized that while my parents had very well meaningfully sort of given me a lot of information, a lot of books, a lot of, studies, but before the internet, I needed something more in life. And on my first week of university, I was totally uninterested in the university library by that point. I thought, you know what, there's no answers in there. But I walked into an aikido dojo and that really spoke to me. I saw something in it that I needed on a very deep level. And that became my main activity for the next 5 or 10 years, including being a living aikido student in different places. And then eventually bringing that into business and then leadership, coaching eventually. So aikido, while I very rarely practice anymore, these days I do other practices, was a sort of root first love for me. I think about aikido the same way someone might think of their first teenage romance.
I love it. And when I think of aikido, I think of using the energy to redirect it. And in facilitation, we often speak of verbal aikido.
Yeah, there's books on verbal aikido. And I actually worked for a charity for 3 years that used aikido principles off the mat in kind of peace building and trauma work and other things. And that also led to what I do now. I think also the concepts, things like centering from aikido are very, very useful for facilitators generally, who are never maybe going to do the martial art, but they can take out some of the tools. And the idea of sort of verbal communication, the impact of presence, the centering, state regulation, these kind of pieces stay with me. I'd say along with the notion of practice, So there's a big split between East and West in philosophy. So in the West, it's like we learn about things, and that's a certain type of knowledge. And in the East, they very much stress working on the person who's doing the things. So like a Japanese scholastic system was much closer to an ancient Greek scholastic system where you develop the person through a practice. So in Japanese schools, it might be judo, it might be aikido, it might be kendo, aikido, all sorts of arts they do. And the idea is to develop the person through practice. And that's an embodied practice rather than a cognitive knowing about. So that idea is very much a big part of my coaching and facilitation today.
I love that. You just mentioned when you said that you walked into the university library, you couldn't be bothered. And I was wondering about the distinction between, so the different forms of intelligence and then the role of intuition. So having the knowledge, the cognitive knowledge is one thing, but then air quotes, and I want to be very careful by the words that I'm using now, embodying the knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you could look at, say, John Vervaeke, Canadian philosopher's distinctions on ways of knowing. I'd say along with me, he's probably the sort of top person in the world on the power of practice and the philosophy and intellectual understanding of that. He's a Tai Chi guy and a meditator, as well as an academic. So, yeah, there's different ways of knowing in the same way as if someone said, hey, I've read a lot of books on kissing. How much do they know about kissing? Or if I said to you, I know about childbirth, right? You might be like, well, really? Come on. Yeah. So I think we intuitively understand this, that there are multiple ways of knowing, and experiential knowing and embodiment are key. On some level, a child or a dog understands embodiment, at least instinctively, but they might not have a kind of conscious practice around it. So, yeah, I think for facilitators, if we understand that the body is a part of being human, and that our culture has often missed out that part or kind of reduced it to an object, or reduced it to a brain taxi, reduced it to a sort of piece of meat.
Taxi.
Yeah, that's one of my colleagues used to say.
Like it.
Then we're really missing a trick in terms of bringing as much as we can to the table to our facilitation.
Yeah. I would be very curious maybe to start with what got you to really dive into the work and to help other people to refind this embodied intuition or intelligence, because as you said, an animal or a child has no problem, and somehow I would say 99% of the adults do have a problem. So how can we relearn it? And what observation got you to
give me one question at a time, because my ADHD brain will
yes,
if you don't mind.
What observation?
I'm a little overstimulated today, so
yes, and I parked the other question down here.
Yeah.
So what observation or experience got you into the work to coach and teach embodiment?
It was probably desperation. So I think I was deeply unhappy, and I realized that the answer wasn't in books, because I'd already read all the books. And I realized I had a very high cognitive intelligence, but maybe not such a good intelligence in other ways. If we go to your reference to multiple intelligences earlier. So I think it was really desperation. And another one I'd say would be instinct. I think your body brain, your body mind, I like to see it as one thing, is very smart. So it's in the same way as we fall in love with people. I fell in love with the practice. You don't fall in love with someone by, looking at their Excel spreadsheet characteristics. It's an instinct. And in that, I think there was a degree of grace, if I can be a little spiritual. I think I was offered a raft while I was drowning. And I was like, thank you very much. That'll do nicely. And then, got on that raft and sailed it to some pretty interesting places later on.
So it's really the realization that it was a support for you, and then it must also be helpful for others.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's just totally selfish. I mean, I just wanted to survive. And it was part of, I think, sort of masculine young man's urge that is often repressed, to simply to be strong, to be potent, let's say. Martial art was the way in. And then later on, I discovered things like dancing, which I couldn't have imagined as a macho young man. Dancing, I was like, wow, my God, meditation, wow, crazy. Opened up into all these other things, of course, because if you pull at one thread of embodiment, you pull at others. And then, as I just developed a love for it, it became very obvious to work with other people, and I work with young people. And then there's one event I saw embodiment, somatics is another word for it, being used in peace work in the Middle East. And that was very impactful to me. I went, oh, there's a lot more here than just throwing each other around and being a tough guy. There's a lot more here. So that definitely opened up a whole new world to me. And then from then I saw sort of leadership work and went on coaching courses and this kind of thing.
And that's an assumption from my part the realization that it's somehow a recognition of our shared humanity. We all have a body that carries us around.
Not that carries us around, that is us. There's the big distinction. What is the you that it carries around? Like this sort of Descartesian kind of way we use English, and we can do that casually. But if we're going to, Heidegger, for example, said we don't have a body, we are bodily. I think that's much more accurate. If we're going to use some German rigor in terms of our language use, you can't beat the Germans for that in terms of philosophers. So we are bodily rather than having a body, which is fine and inexact normal English, but not accurate. Sorry, I lost my point there. But what were you saying?
That it's this uniting force that we are all a body.
Yes, on one level, we have death, taxes, and embodiment, right? That's really it in terms of what brings us together. We all suffer and we all love. So there's that. But there's also a particular set of techniques called embodied peace building, which are essentially about nervous system regulation. So, for example, I taught in Sierra Leone, right? I taught soldiers, and after the Civil War, that was pretty nasty. And I was teaching mediation to soldiers. And we'd have a few rules, like no guns in the training room. Another rule was no one was allowed to stand up. Because if you've ever had an argument sitting down, as soon as it stands up, it escalates. And if you can't stand up, you can't escalate. And then another thing we did is we teach everyone some basic breathing techniques to regulate. And I pre-agreed that if I raised my hands, everyone had to stop talking and do a breathing technique for a minute. So that meant that if it started to escalate, we had a couple of breaks we could put on, the kind of fight-flight system kicking in, because we're not at our best when we're in that stress response, right? And people aren't so kind, they're not so creative, they're not so smart. So, facilitators do a lot of work on saying clever things, but what's the nervous system those clever things are landing on? If people are all fucked up, excuse my language, it's just not gonna go well. So, whether it's soldiers you don't want to kill each other, or just participants in a corporate workshop that are stressed and you just want to learn the most possible, in their time they have, in their precious time, then something very basic like getting people to regulate their nervous systems to reduce their fight or flight. I mean, even today, I've had a very intense day. We're doing this crowdfunder. It's going great, but it's super intense. And I just took 1 minute before this interview to be like, okay, feet on the ground. Let's take a breath. And I've done that a couple of times as I'm talking, actually. And it's starting to kick in now in a really nice way. I didn't have 20 minutes to do yoga or an hour to do meditation. I didn't have that much time. So something like centering could just help any facilitator. That's coaches love that stuff as well.
And when you say centering, I imagine feet on the ground, breathing into the stomach. What do you mean by centering?
Yeah, I wrote a whole book on it. So there's different definitions. My definition would be any quick, effective, physical and invisible state regulation technique. So anything which we could up-regulate as well, right? So we could use the terminology, like if I wanted to wake up, I could do that pretty quickly. That's not technically centering because it wasn't invisible, but I wanted to show you something. Like I could just do that more subtly. I like them to be effective, quick and invisible. So you can do them in a meeting, while facilitating, while coaching, while driving. If you have to close your eyes and lie down, it's not much use for most people. Nice as it is to do a yoga class, you just don't have time most of the time.
So and then I imagine that it's very individual. So everyone will then find their own way to center or regulate.
No, not at all. So the fight-flight response is a basic mammalian response. I've taught in 50 countries all around the world. People have the same basic response. When people get angry, nobody says, I hate you. Then that would be weird, right? To relax and expand in hate, that would be weird. Dogs have the same basic response as we do, in terms just mammals do. So it's the basic fight or flight response is near identical. There are some cultural ways it can be moved, but basically more or less identical. And the ways out of it are more or less identical. So there is some tweaking and slightly different techniques, but essentially it's pretty universal.
And I think the first time I became aware of that was with Amy Cuddy's TED Talk.
Power poses.
The power poses. And I remember that before going in any class, when I just started teaching, I would do a power pose on the...
Well, it changes your state, right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting the replication issues around that, but because the scientists who are replicating it weren't embodiment teachers, they were making some quite big mistakes. And Amy Cuddy equally just didn't have a framework for these discoveries. As well as power poses, God love the Americans, we could also have humility poses. And some people might be better served by those. I mean, we have a system of 26 poses for different things. We have one for boundaries and one for openness and one for sensuality and one for authority. And different people do need different, beyond simply reducing fight or flight. If we go more specific, like Amy's ones around sort of dominance, testosterone, taking up space, which are very useful for some people. But I don't know, I've been in many facilitations where I wish the Americans would have a bit less of that and let the Indians talk, like there's cultural differences around embodiment.
Yeah. And I think, so that's very interesting in the sense that I can see now where the coaching parts comes in and also the self-awareness part. So what do you have already enough of? And I think also, and maybe that's an interesting part also for the audience, that the fight, flight, freeze response is something very embodied. So we feel it if we are in this kind of...
Do it. You enact it. And maybe you feel it. Not always.
Yes. I spent many, many hours meditating. I did a few Vipassana retreats where I did get aware of what happens in the body. And I think the majority of professionals have lost that.
Majority of people in Western culture, it's a weakness. Western culture is wonderful, has many strengths. I'm not one of its biggest critics. I love it. But I think we have issues with technology, with lack of movement, even just being indoors all day. There's a whole bunch of, we could say, disembodiment factors, and these range from the very practical to the very philosophical.
So how can we bring it back? And I think that was also the question that I parked earlier here.
Yeah.
So how can we relearn it?
Yeah, the one word answer is practice. Okay. You could say the 3 Ps, which is people, places, and practice. So I would advise people to spend more time in the natural world. I would advise people to spend more time in communities of embodiment because it's something that resonates between us. And also one needs a basic body awareness practice. And on our coaching courses, the answer to that would take an hour to explain. And we sort of very skillfully say that, do this 5 times a day and this for 10 minutes in the morning and this before you eat and this 10 minutes at night. And we kind of give you a whole bunch of what we found over many years to be the most effective, time efficient way to bring back consistent body awareness more deeply, more consistently, of more of the body, more of the time.
Yeah. And we'll put the links in the show notes so that the audience can find you and your teachings. When I think of embodiment and also this practice, I cannot help myself but think of the more woo-woo side of things, the yoga. And when I look at you, you're not the woo-woo kind of embodiment at all, if I may say so. So where does the bad reputation, I would say, or maybe it's not a bad reputation, the reputation come from?
Sure.
And what would be your argument to get others who maybe feel reluctant to the reputation to find their way back to their bodies?
So let me take those one at a time. So the reputation comes because modernity is a disembodied state, particularly if we look at it in industrial consumer culture. So the average person is pretty disembodied, and there's reasons for that politically, socially, culturally, historically. But there's another movement kind of within modernity, of post-modernity, and also the Romantic movement. You're German, so you know about that. And this Romantic movement has been a counterculture force throughout modernity. And that has always, in the same way as modernity overemphasizes logic and reason, kind of masculine side of things, if you will, the Romantic movement overemphasizes body and feeling to the point of being superstitious at times and a bit silly, let's be honest. So you have sort of 2 polar extremes within the culture and the counterculture. And obviously the sort of hippies of the 60s kind of represent that. Though I would say since the 90s, there's been a movement of integration. So it's not, nowadays, yoga is much more mainstream. Mindfulness has definitely got, my life in the corporate world has totally changed. It's much easier now than it was 20 years ago when I started, like really things have changed. So that integration has already happened. It's no longer woo-woo to do, I know lots of HR managers, for example, who meditate or do yoga. It's just normal now. They've got the app at least. So I think that integration has already happened. How do we approach it with the more rational people? My basic is always try it. I walk in and say, like, give this a try, whether it's soldiers or police or corporate, give it a try. Don't believe me. So we go from a rational, experimental kind of mindset. You can use a bit in neuroscience and show a brain with a blob of color on. You can talk about the power poses research. I mean, honestly, though, your own embodiment is key. When I walk in a room to a group of, say, soldiers or business people, they take one look at me and they go, he's all right. So if you're not floating in, hi, my name's Shakti Yoga Pants, like fucking dress right, speak right, put it in concerns. If I go to a room and I say, who here has stress? All the hands go up. And if I say, who here would like in the next 3 minutes to learn a practical tool to reduce your stress? It's from the martial arts. It's called centering. Do you want to give it a go? Everyone's going to give it a go, unless they're like really unreasonable. Yeah. So there's 1 in 100 who's just an asshole, but most people are fine. Most people are eminently teachable if you offer them something useful.
So what I hear is, one is your presence. So how you enter the room, and your confidence, not only the embodied confidence, but also what you say. And this, I have noticed also as a facilitator, I asked managers to do all sorts of weird things. And I think it has never happened to me that someone would say,
what do you do? It's okay, right? Like people will do some quite weird stuff these days. People are pretty cool. Like I've worked with telecoms companies in the Netherlands and German and Russian, and I'm just surprised how open people are, to be honest, as long as you're pretty confident about it. And you don't try and make them believe something about chakras or whatever, right? And I train my students, we call it unicorn killing. We train them like not to use words. Like if they say energy or chakra, they, immediately get something thrown at them. Playfully, obviously. So it's, we have games around this to help the facilitators de-hippify a bit. Because I train people from the corporate coaching world, but also from like the yoga world or the dance world. And they sometimes, I help give them some help on how to dress and how to talk and make sure the package doesn't turn people off.
De-hippify.
De-hippify. Unicorn. Yeah.
And you mentioned energy. What is it with the energy? Because, is there energy between people? Is there energy in the space?
Yes, but what do you mean? So it's not that it's a meaningless word. The problem is it means too many things. So what are we talking about? Are we talking about like an electromagnetic thing? Maybe. Are we talking about just mirror neurons and visual kind of empathy? That's another thing. Are we talking about what are we talking about? How states resonate between people? Sure, those are all important phenomena. But as soon as all of those matter, but as soon as you use the E word, I have no idea what you're talking about. So I'd rather people just avoided that and were more specific. Like, let's be a bit more German about it. Like, what exactly do you mean? Yeah. So rather than say energy.
And I think that's such a good practice in general, because very often I call it, we operate in the illusion of alignment.
Nice concept.
That we all think, we're absolutely for that. Yes, transparency. Totally up for it.
Yeah.
Now we publish your salary. Oh, no, not this kind of transparency.
Yeah. Well, nice example. Yeah, so that's a nice way of talking about that. Usually what happens in communication is we think we're talking about the same thing until we get to some consequence that's different as a result of a different understanding. Yeah.
And I think there's this, and maybe these words like energy, they really attracted. It feels so, we're an in-group because we speak about energy and we just assume that we all mean the same thing. And then it feels cozy, fluffy, touchy-feely.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds good. And everybody likes to believe they have magic powers, right? Everyone wants to think they're special. So there's a narcissism in it as well.
Yeah. And then there's several topics that come to my mind, and I will not throw them at you at the same time. Holding space. I was expecting that. And
what does it mean? Like mean paying attention? Let's just talk about that then. What do you mean?
So holding space is one of those concepts in facilitation that we create an environment and context where, and that's, again, it's very fluffy.
So what do you mean? Do you mean there's ethical ground rules? Do you mean that you're attentive? Do you mean that you establish the group in a certain way?
I think that there are ground rules that the facilitator who's in charge of that will defend, call in and call out behavior that is wanted or unwanted, so that those who are inside can be themselves.
There's the problem between This is kind of metaphors and actuality, right?
Yeah.
So it's a metaphor, which is fine. But if we're going to say, are you doing it or not? So, for example, at the moment, I'm marking exams, video exams for my students. Now, I need to objectively go, what are we looking at? Because we have a kind of inter-rater reliability system. If I fail someone, one of my colleagues is like 95% likely to fail the same person, right? So unless we have an objective kind of measure of that, like I can talk about the language use, I can talk about embodiment, the state, like there's probably more exact ways of talking about it, which it might be fine if with me and you sitting in a cafe saying, oh yeah, I was holding space today for a group, casual language use is not the same as sometimes we need a more exact language use.
And I think that's a very good point. Who is the audience of the language we are using? Because if we are amongst ourselves in our little facilitator bubble, we can speak about holding space as much as we want. As soon as a client comes in who does not know the world, then it's very quick that we get the woo-woo stamp and then we lose them.
Right, we lose authority with them and trust. And are we doing engineering or poetry? Both are beautiful and valid.
Another question that comes back to what you mentioned, that the way you walk into a space when you first introduced, so how to first introduce embodiment, and it was this sort of presence. And you said you look at the people, or no, the people look at you and think, oh, he's okay.
He's like, the soldiers would say to me, did you used to be a soldier? And I'll say, no, but I've been around enough soldiers that I know how to walk into a room of soldiers. Right. And the Buddhists, they're like, you're a Buddhist, right? And I'm like, oh, kind of, I meditate. Right. So like, that's part of our skill. You kind of referred to this earlier. We need to have awareness and choice. This is the basic equation, right? So aware of our patterns, which you can't meditate on, you won't notice them through meditation. There's other ways to do that. So aware of our patterns and our state, which you can notice through mindfulness. And we also need to be able to shift our states and our patterns to build range and to be able to change our state.
And I'm curious about the other way around. So they looked at you and judged you depending on how you walked in. And I'm curious, how do you walk into a room and judge the body language? How do you read one of those, right? How do you read the room?
Read the room, feel the energy. These are all just smell the culture. These are all just metaphors. And they're all fine. So what you're doing, consciously and unconsciously, I teach people to do this better. But we all do it unconsciously. We'd say, hey, man, this restaurant's got a nice ambience, or this stadium's got a great energy, right? We use words like this. The kids talk about vibe check. The kids say, hey, man, I went on a date. I did a vibe check. She was great. that's what they're talking about. So vibe check, that's a thing. So what it means is like embodied assessment. It means their embodiment landed on me in a particular way. Their embodiment I interpret in a particular way, because unless you're a psychopath, bodies resonate, right? Like, I'm kind of fired up today. Everyone around me is going to feel that. They're going to be like, wow, okay, this is upbeat. So I'm coffee today. Another day I might be chamomile tea. Like we're having an impact in our embodiment, and those embodiments are meeting. So being able to read a room, that's partly a logical assessment. Like I can look at how people are sitting and standing and tell you plenty of things about them from their body language, you might think of it as. But embodiment's a bit deeper than body language. And the second thing is I feel it. Do I go in the room and I get like really tense? Right? Do I go, oh, something's going on here? Or do I go in the room and feel like, wow, it's just joyful. It's like a party. I love training in Italy. Let's, hey, let's have a fun time, Like they're the two methods you use, more cognitive and more empathic.
And so I understand that this became something that you have trained so long, so it happens instantaneously. What are the signals that we are picking up? Because I think, especially when someone is not as trained, maybe they feel something, they get an intuition, but then can they trust the intuition? Especially if we're nervous, then also our energy, our state of mind, our state of being. Oh, is this again woo-woo?
It's tricky in language, isn't it? It's really tricky because you're a prisoner to the language we have in English, right? And and there's lots of examples of that. Even anatomical stuff, like you're German, right? So you have a shame bone, and which is not so great, but you also have a rib basket instead of a rib cage, which is much nicer than the English. So we're real prisoners to language unless we're quite conscious. So your question was like, I look at people, I read the room, I feel that. Often it's unconscious. So a dog will feel it unconsciously. Like a dog knows if you're the boss or he's the boss.
Yeah.
Right.
And what would you advise people to look for? What do you think are the signs that can give us
Well, the
an
main thing
idea.
is you yourself are relaxed enough that you can pick up on the signals. So that's the first thing I say is being able to regulate yourself. So otherwise you'll be blind to it. There's too much noise kind of going on in the receiving device, as it were. And then there's specifics. So I teach people models like 4 elements and different things where I could go, this leg position is more common in Russia. This thing might indicate stress. And like that's a whole training. So,
And 4 elements are the 4 elements of fire, water.
Yeah, it's just a metaphorical model for understanding differences between people.
Okay.
So certain cultures might be more watery or more airy or whatever, certain groups of people, certain departments. It's just, again, it's just a language. It's not literal. Yeah. So we give people languages so they can have a shared understanding with us in terms of what they're looking at. And then we can give them specifics, right? Like you could learn about pupil dilation, or you could learn about breath in the top of the chest versus the belly, or different specifics you can look for.
Okay. And then I assume that the more you're aware of your own body and states of relaxation, then the more you're also aware where the others are.
If you are too tense, the empathic resonance that naturally happens for all non-psychopathic people will not happen. So essentially, when you're stressed, you're a psychopath. You just don't empathize.
I can subscribe to that.
Yeah, we all do things we regret when we're in a bad mood.
Don't be around me when I'm stressed.
Give me the things I do when I'm hungry, So it's, when our physiological state is stressed, we're not picking up on stuff. We're not empathizing so easily. And then there's the cognitive stuff, which again, if you're in fight or flight, your just brain doesn't work as well. You're not smart. You won't hear as much, see as much, observe as much.
Yeah. And I was wondering for a very long time, because I assume, maybe I'm just overconfident, that I can sense the state. I can read a room even online.
Yeah, for sure. It's harder for most people because there's less signals. Like I can't smell you now. Like I can smell someone's fear. That's normal. It's like I can't smell you and I can't see all of your body and I don't have quite so much empathic resonance, but I can see enough of you. Like I can see your shoulders are relaxed and you're nodding and your pupils are a certain dilation and your head's tilted and your blink rate isn't too high. Like that's all obvious. And you might not know that you pick up on that, but if someone were to like tense their jaw and start blinking more and have their head in a different angle and their shoulders more tense, you would unconsciously pick up on that. I mean, a child can.
Like this? So if I just look straight in the camera,
you're like,
and I stop blinking, then there's a kind of,
a lot more. There's lots, but again, I'm not a body language teacher. So the main thing is though, that if you pay attention to bodies, these things that are unconscious become much more conscious. Like I'll give you an example. I was in a hotel a couple of days ago in Slovenia. We were cooking some chicken. It set off the fire alarm. Woman came to the door, knocked on the door. She said, "Are you smoking?" And I could hear from her tone of voice, see from her face, she was very stressed. And I just made a conscious effort to relax and said, "We're not smoking. It's the chicken. I'll open a window. There's no," and I could, help regulate her, co-regulation, right? I could see she was stressed immediately. Someone else might have picked up on the stress on some level, but they might have just felt like she just wasn't a very nice person. They might have got into a conflict with her. Whereas, I had enough conscious awareness to be like, okay, for whatever reason, this poor hotel member of staff is panicking and I need to reassure her that everything's going to be fine.
Thank you. That's a wonderful example.
Simple daily. And parents do this all the time, right? Like this is like I've worked a lot with kids and you're constantly co-regulating them. You're constantly up-regulating them to get them going in the morning and down-regulating them to get stressed. I mean, these are normal human capacities. Every time we flirt, we do these. These are basic human capacities to up and down regulate each other, whether it be adults, with kids, whatever. And
then it's interesting how we forget about these in moments, either when we're stressed or,
we lose our skills. And there are some people who are more talented than others, right? Usually the people we like being around. Good facilitators are just naturally talented at this stuff, but by making it conscious, you can make it way more effective, efficient, way more conscious, just helpful.
Yeah. I have somehow this weird idea of embodying ourselves in my mind.
What do you mean by that?
And thank you for asking. Where I have the impression that we very often wear a mask in a sense that not showing up to be more professional than we actually feel. So trying to hide our imposter, our insecurities, who we really are. And I wonder what it takes to relearn to embody ourselves, and thereby, I mean, just be our authentic us.
Yeah, I mean, you're really talking about not regulating yourself to a kind of perceived image. I mean, talk
Mm-hmm.
about authentic expression, essentially, which builds trust and takes less energy. What it takes is courage.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't talk about virtue very much anymore, which I think is a shame. What it takes is courage, right? Some might say vulnerability, but it's another one of those words that's a bit inexact. Yeah, I mean, another way of looking at it is like it takes like fuck you. It takes like I don't care. The Greeks had a word for this. Alcibiades, people look him up. There was there's that added. The Vikings definitely had this, and the Irish, which is my people, so where I come from, they had this, and it's a quality of don't give a shit. And like I'm going to be who I'm going to be. I'm not going to bend myself out of shape for anyone. Like I
And
feel like that's a huge trait, and I regularly get told I'm refreshing or authentic or something like that. But for me, I'm working way too much to not be that. It takes way too much energy to pretend to be someone else. I can't be bothered. It's too much work. So it's like, and there's no real benefit to pretending to be someone else because people see through it anyway, right? People are really good at smelling bullshit on that.
This is very true. And I think it was Seth Godin who said, just be yourself, everyone else is taken anyway.
Yeah, from a marketing point of view, Seth's great. And from a marketing point of view, it's absolutely essential. You're not pizza, not everyone loves you, right? Like my style of teaching embodiment, which is quite yang, it's quite fire and air, let's say, if we use the elements, it's quite warrior joker energy. Like that is not everyone's cup of tea. And that's okay. Some people I swear too much or tell too many jokes or I'm too quick or they want something more hippie, more abstract. That's fine. There's other teachers. There's lots of great teachers.
And the beauty of it, in theory, is that then the crowd self-selects and you attract those you want to work with. And who was it who said that, is it Marmite? You either love it or you hate it.
Marmite Mark, I get that a lot. Yeah. Yeah, for listeners who don't know, that's a spread that you can get in Australia. It's called Vegemite, and some people just love it, and some people just take. There's a yeast extract, so it's got a very strong flavor. I think in the internet marketing, you have to stand out. You have to stand out. So if you don't polarize, this also works for dating. But if you don't polarize at all, like it's bland. Who wants
vanilla?
Bland?
Yeah, I mean, and then you don't speak to anyone.
Yeah, you need someone that you speak to. So it's okay to turn people off, like I deliberately put heads on spikes, I want people to know that whether it's for them or not, we say it on our brochure, we say on our website, come to one of my live trainings, we're like, no new age Muppets, no woke people. We're like really clear, like we're not for everyone.
I love it. And I love the we phrase that courage and vulnerability are actually the two sides of the same thing. It's just a different word for it, because in order to be vulnerable, you need to be courageous.
I don't want to talk about vulnerability. It's boring, it's inexact, and no one knows what they're talking about. Brené Brown has a lot to answer for.
And I love the courage part. That's what I meant. And I acknowledge how difficult it is. So do you have a courage post then as well as a...
Well, I mean, courage is a lot of the time is really about self-regulating, right? Because why don't people do a brave thing? It's not that people aren't scared. I'm a bit scared every time I get interviewed. I'm anxious a bit, like people are judging me, I've been interviewed many times, but I still get a bit anxious. Definitely if I speak on a big stage with a few hundred people. But I can self-regulate, so the fear isn't overwhelming, right? So like the centering techniques, for example, would be a big part of that. The taking space ones, like the power poses, they're useful. Not smallifying, shrinking. I think there's a word for it in German. There isn't in English, but this sort of making yourself small. One of my teachers, Paul Linden, speaks German, so I talk to him sometimes. But yes, there's a bunch of stuff you could do. But don't smallify, bigify, and relax.
Yeah. And then practice, I guess.
Yeah, it's all practice. It's very boring, actually. Like my students always they ask me a question, everyone eye rolls because they know what I'm going to say. I mean, essentially, the answer to any skill is practice. If I want to learn to drive or learn sport, or if I want to learn to speak French, I have to practice, right? Like it is the answer to almost any skill-based learning. And the only reason people don't realize that it's not obvious to them is because we have this idea that you can learn something once and you can't. Skills take repetition, feedback, etc.
Yeah, and then practicing to be ourselves is maybe the most difficult one. And I think for a facilitator, if it's I believe that it's my job to make sure that the people in the room do feel comfortable enough to be themselves, to be brave. And they can only be themselves if I model, so if I dare to be myself. So I think that this authenticity part is very important for facilitators.
Yeah, I mean, if you're not authentic, you're missing your superpower and you won't be trusted. Personally, I don't want my participants to always be comfortable. I don't care much about that. I like to create an unsafe space where they'll be challenged. So, yeah.
Did you just say unsafe space?
Absolutely. Ooh. The last thing I want is a safe space. No one learns in a safe space. God help us, safe spaces. Fuck that.
I dare to disagree, and I do believe that in the end we mean the same thing.
Yeah, you don't know what we're talking about yet, do we then, right? Like, because if you mean ethical, I agree with you.
For me, the safe space is the space where we can be uncomfortable.
So what you're talking about is a challenging space.
Exactly. So it's a space where we don't feel judged.
Oh, no, I want to judge my students. Definitely judge my students. That's hard. I want to judge them absolutely because I have skills and discernment they don't. So I definitely judge my students. I judge them morally and intellectually.
Oh, wow.
Because I want them to be better.
Mm-hmm.
Not like, imagine raising a child without judgment. What a ridiculous idea. Like they have to know this is better than that. This will make them a better embodiment coach. There might be several ways to do it. And morally, I want them to increase their virtue. And that requires judgment. Like this
judgment of skills and judgment of doing, but not judgment of being.
Absolutely judgment of being. That's the only thing I'm interested in.
Oh,
I'm being slightly provocative here to get you.
Yes, please.
But it's I'm playing a little bit. I like to play. I'm a bit naughty. But I want them to develop virtue. I want them to embody something bolder, bigger, more than what they are. I want the acorn to become an oak. The oak is better than the acorn. That's a judgment. It's better. It's a moral judgment.
And then you provoke them to stand up for themselves and actually to break free of all these and to basically lean into this fuck you pose or attitude.
That's one thing they might need. They might need support. They might need encouragement. A lot of people just need a bit of love. It's not all fuck you. There's a lot of, I do most of my workshops be loving people, but that's anything that's necessary to get them to learn the skills and to grow. And feeling safe is maybe sometimes useful, but it's not that useful.
Interesting. Because I would have thought that for me, the safe space is one where we don't get into the fight, flight, freeze mode.
I systematically get people into the fight, flight, freeze mode deliberately and in a calibrated way.
Because it's part of the training.
Absolutely. Yeah. What's the point in making a training that's so easy that people can't learn to deal with stress? But I mean, that's like a gym, right? Where you lift weights. You don't just throw weights. If I took you to the gym with me, right, I wouldn't just give you 500 kilos to bench press because you'd die. I'd give you 50 kilos and see how that went, and then we'd change the weight, right?
Yeah. And it's so to calibrate the challenge so that they're still in the growth zone instead of breaking down.
Generally, with a little bit of anarchy. I mean, you need the right balance of order and chaos, but generally we're calibrating people, as you say, into the growth zone. So they're not in the safe space and they're not in the boring zone and they're not in the trauma zone, right? We don't traumatize people.
Yeah.
I mean, this phrase, safe space, is a horrible phrase. It's from America. Safe isn't even a feeling. It wasn't a feeling. It's a misunderstanding of Stephen Porges, who I know quite well, and I know his work quite well. And it was just a way for whiny, weak, complainy people to gain power over the rest of us. And I reject it utterly. So this whole safe space culture needs to die.
Amen. Yeah, I think this would be an entire conversation as such.
We probably agree a lot more than it looks like, actually.
I think so too, because I think we both agree that we learn when we are challenged. And I think for your work, it's even more important to experience the edges of discomfort. And I believe that we both agree that we don't want to traumatize those who are in the room.
I rarely traumatize my participants. 10% casualties at worst. So it's not I do trauma training and I set up a charity in Ukraine doing trauma training, right? So actually there's a impeccable consent and impeccable calibration of issues. Like we're the only people that are better than us would be like kink clubs. Like we're very strong on those principles.
Yeah. And this for me is the safe space that Well, you can calibrate it, or the psychological safety, where we just don't get into the fight, flight, freeze mode. Enough semantics.
Yeah.
According to you, what makes a workshop fail?
Misalignment between, you sent me this one beforehand, actually, and I thought about it for a good minute, which is a lot for me for most questions. And I'd say misalignment between the goal and the delivery. So it's really simple. It's not a very sexy answer, but the workshops I see don't work are when people expect something they're not going to get, or the trainer can't deliver what that's been expected. So, if you come to me and say, hey, it's a one-day workshop on embodied tools for coaches, I can definitely deliver that. Okay. And if someone comes relatively open-minded, basically like not drunk and able to learn, they will come out of there with that. Even if they don't like me personally, they will be a happy customer in terms of what they got. What makes, a plumbing job not work? Same thing, right? Is there an alignment between what's expected and what's delivered? So that's one level of answer. And then I could talk about, my many failures as a trainer and what's led me, over my 20,000 hours of experience, which ones were not such great hours and where I fucked up. And there's many examples I could give of things that led me personally to fail. That's another topic.
Would you be open to share one? I think we learned so much from these.
I'll give you a real little one. I worked for an opera house 15 years ago, right? And I came in and I talked to the management and I did a training for the management. And that worked really well. And I was like, did a team building, shit hot, really, really got a lot from it. They got a lot from it. Everyone was happy. And then the next day, I was doing one for the lighting team, but they're much more like working class, shop floor, kind of blue collar kind of guys. I came in dressed in my management suit, speaking my management talk, and they were just like, screw you. And they didn't want anything to do with it. And yeah, that's just an example of not reading the room, those early days for me. And I was like, oh yeah, it's one organization, but they're real different categories within that, the departments. So I didn't make the mistake the third day when the wigs team, they have a whole wigs department at opera houses. So there's an example of both making a mistake and learning from it, I think. Just a little one.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And for me, it also shows the nuance between you can be authentic and all, so it's still you. You're not playing a role, but by the way you're holding you, how you dress, how you show up, and merge into the space, respond to your audience makes a big impact.
Yeah, and I'd say you also just need to know your flaws, right? Like I'm deeply flawed. Like I can be arrogant, I can use jokes way too much, I can be far too provocative. Like I have many flaws, and I think anyone who doesn't know their flaws is a fool. And there's definitely times I've pushed things too far and made too many jokes. And sometimes you're like, when I'm teaching in Berlin, oh my God. But again, that really comes down to just like the fit, like, is it a fit? So sometimes the mistakes in the marketing, like we started adding like more provocative stuff to the flyers, to the website, because we were like, otherwise people are going to get shocked. So sometimes the most dangerous people in workshops are usually ones who haven't paid any money and have come as a referral from a friend. Like they're the people who have a bad time because they haven't done their homework and they haven't been filtered.
I love that. And there's, I see a distinction between a failure where it's just a mismatch. Okay, someone hasn't done their homework and your style doesn't, or our style doesn't resonate with the group.
Not a good fit. And I'll tell them, I'll come up to them in break and I'll say, look, I know you want to talk about your feelings endlessly and narcissistically, like this was a group therapy session. That's not a good fit for what happens here. Do you want to do what we're doing or do you want to leave? And if you want to leave, that's cool. Like it's like dating, not everyone's your cup of tea. Like meet the most beautiful woman in the world, but she's a lesbian. I got no chance. I need to accept that, So it's just like, that's just life, So I feel like that fit is what marketing is all about.
And that's where, so the expectations that you mentioned, where it's really important, A, to send the right message, and B, to have the conversation first.
Alignment, definitely. Yeah. I'm like, watch a couple of videos. Like people listening to this, right? Some people listening to this are going, wow, this guy's great. It's fun. It's refreshing. Other people like, I will never come to a workshop with this guy. If someone's really timid and they want that safe space, or I just speak too fast for them, right? It's like all sorts of things. Actually, I work with a German colleague and she speaks much slower than me. And some people go to her classes and not mine. And I'm like, I'm okay with that. It's just practical.
So. Perfect. Diversification.
Yeah, why not? And like I always co-teach with a woman, for example, because it's like that, some people's lands differently and it's just helpful.
And what remains your facilitation challenge after so many years?
I'd say managing my well-being while managing a company, managing a trauma charity, being an intense lifelong learner, and being on the road, that will always remain a challenge. I think keeping in good energy, just in terms of my own subjective, my well-being, I mean by that in that case, getting enough sleep, eating right. So there's just a very, very practical challenge of that. Training coaches, doesn't feel like hugely challenging. There's always learning edges. I was doing a coaching session a few days ago and I was working with a woman from Bosnia, and then this like hardcore trauma piece came in that neither of us was expecting. And, that's never easy if you're holding the weight of the pain of the Balkans or wherever it is. So that's always, to be treated with some respect. Yeah, they're the things. This fun one at the moment, I'm trying to learn how young men speak. Like they have the whole nother language. Everything's Ohio, and so I'm just learning. It's like learning a new language. So that's kind of fun because I'm started a project doing weightlifting, coaching through weightlifting with very young men, like 15, 18, and they're like aliens. They just grew up with a different brain. So that's kind of fun to learn about them.
What got you into that niche?
Well, my embodied practice shifted over the years from aikido to dance to yoga, and it's been weightlifting for a while. And it's very practical because I can do it anywhere in the world, and there's gyms everywhere. It's free any time of day, and it's also what young men do. The charity I started in Ukraine was mostly young women because the guys are all fighting there. So it's all young women I was working with. And after sort of 2 or 3 years of supervising that, I just went, I'd like to work with young guys, and they seem to resonate with me. They look up to me as their cool uncle. And I was like, this is just kind of satisfying. And, I can do it in the gym because they don't want to do therapy. They don't want to talk about their feelings. But in the gym, you can do some cool stuff with them. So it's just around a bunch. And I thought, why not? So that's our latest project. We've got a YouTube channel called Feral Philosophy. And it's repackaging a lot of my life's work really into a kind of new way. So
cool. And is it then also, if we exhaust our body, that it will be easier just to not to overthink and to be more ourselves, and maybe even to let some feelings slip through?
Yeah, there's a few things you can do with the muscularity of the gym. You could work on a particular embodiment, like a bench press is like boundaries, right? Like pushing away. I've done a lot of work with people pleasers and boundaries. So there's some specifics. And then there's also just the fact that it's titrated. So like a normal coaching or therapy session is very intense. Like me, you talking about you, feeling, and women usually love that, but young guys, they hate that, man. Whereas in a gym, you can have a little chat, do a quick set, stretch it out, have another little chat, just takes the pressure off. So that's another thing. And then, as you say, muscular exhaustion often opens up people emotionally because there's a kind of the armoring bands, we call them in embodiment, are the sort of bands of tension that kind of hold the emotion together in a certain way. So it actually just loosens the whole person. It's called character structure in Reichian and kind of embodied psychoanalysis. So yeah, there's a piece there on character structure, but there's all sorts of ways to work with them. You can use the gym as a metaphor. You can just use it to make their state more positive. I mean, try being depressed when you're doing an overhead press. Like you can't do it. It's impossible. So if somebody's like, what do I do in my life? I'm rubbish. You say, okay, let you get them doing the overhead press. And then you ask them again, all of a sudden you get a different answer.
I think I heard something similar with jumping jacks.
Yeah, same thing. Thing. That's one of my examples. You can't be depressed while doing jumping jacks or being on a trampoline or whatever, right? So like this, as coaches, we tend to think the clever question's the key thing, but what's the state the clever question is landing into? Because if it's not a useful state, you're not going to get a useful answer.
Yeah. I know. I wonder what would happen with a group that is into complaining mode and only seeing the negative and cynical to just start a workshop with a few jumping jacks.
Yeah, or uncross their arms, get them to uncross their arms and legs, stand up, but just get them to stand up, even like less weird than that.
Yeah.
There's just, I get people walking around the room, just real simple stuff. If you're working corporate, yeah. I mean, walking around the room is weird enough. Jumping jacks may be too much.
Yeah, that's also true. And then thinking back to the sitting down for not escalating,
these are just mundane examples. People can look on YouTube for more sophisticated stuff, and it's difficult on a podcast to kind of demo the more soul stuff.
Yeah, and it's very often, I think it's the most mundane that that resonates the deepest? Because maybe we intuitively know it, or we're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Why haven't I thought about it before myself?
I give you an example. I'll say to my coaches, I'll teach them a technique, and I'll say, right, let's do some coaching practice. Everyone gets chairs. Why? Like, why not do your coaching standing or walking? I mean, lying down even, if the floor's clean, or, on a nice grassy summer day,
Yeah.
But like, why sit down? I mean, you might want to sit down. It's a basic posture. It might be helpful, but it might not. It might be better to lie down, stand down, or I do most of my coaching walking.
And I wonder whether this is actually trained behavior. So, okay, we learn something, we sit down like in school, but
Right.
when we walk, we're so much more creative, actually.
Well, let me ask listeners this, right? Where do you have your best ideas? And I guarantee you it's in one of these places. It's walking in nature, it's in the shower, or on the toilet. What do these have in common? You're relaxed and you're moving. Yeah. It's not when you're sitting in a chair. And if coaching is about having newer ideas to solve problems, why on earth would we make people sit still? It's just a weird hangover from school.
So I have a bad habit that I picked up when I was 13 and thought I was cool when I smoked. So I've quit about 1,000 times at least.
Not easy.
No. Well, it's so easy. I've done it so many times. Who said that? I don't know. But it's similar. The stepping outside and having a cigarette is the one moment where you relax, you change, but it only works when you just start it again. If you're then into the smoking habit, it vanishes. So.
Yeah, and even just stepping out away from your desk and having a breath of air, for many people, like if you were to smoke a cigarette that had no cigarette in, like a empty vape or whatever, even just stepping outside, maybe socializing with someone, maybe just looking at the clouds, getting a perspective. I mean, I'm jealous of smokers when I see them on a smoking break. It looks nice, like I get it.
Yeah, that's what I do now. I step on the balcony to just breathe.
I used to have a stretch break. I used to work in an office years ago, and every time my colleague went out for a cigarette, I was allowed to stretch for 3 minutes. And that was just the deal. I'm like, she's smoking, I'm stretching.
Yeah. Love it. What would you, when you think back of when you just started, so you found Aikido, you decided, okay, I'll get into the training coaching space. What is the thing that you would have wished to know then?
Yeah, I mean, there was a stage in between those two things, which was me working in NGOs and war zones and conflict areas. But in terms of what I would have liked to have known, I guess like business skills. Like it took me a while to learn. I'm not from that background, and just to learn, like a lot of my mentees, I teach basic marketing. I was teaching last night, like money mindset, and the week before I was teaching copywriting, and the week before I was teaching social media, and I've learned all that stuff. And now embodiment people think I'm like a wizard, but I'm like a 5 out of 10. Like I'm good enough. Like at marketing, and it took me a while to get that stuff. So that I was poor for a few years until I got that stuff. So
yeah. And when you say you teach money mindset, and I would assume that it still has to do with embodiment practice.
Sure. Everything, there's no such thing as mindset, right? It's always body set. It's just awkward to say.
Exactly. That's why I just stumbled over the word. So what is the embodied approach to a mindset shift?
Oh, there's loads. It's like looking at your stress responses around money, looking at your stories around money, which are embodied. So, is there scarcity, for example, cultural stories? Different people have different cultural stories around money. Embodied capacities are like giving, holding, and receiving, like 3 capacities in terms of money is 3 embodiments. I'm looking at people's stress responses while asking for money, for example, and using centering to reduce those. That's a really practical one people can try. There's a lot of, my clients have difficulty asking for money for their services. Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of embodied patterns that we could go into, but money's pretty deep. It's really like sex, power, money, like their base chakra, kind of lower energy kind of stuff. That's survival level for a lot of people. So
you use all the forbidden words in one
exactly.
sentence.
I'm so naughty. And again, I could tell you exactly what I meant by that, right? But so it's a placeholder. They're fine. They're not forbidden words. They're words you can use casually. Yeah. So like survival level stuff is really important. And money is surprisingly emotional for people as a topic. I do provocations. I'll burn a £50 note, or I'll ask people to tell me how much money they have in their bank account publicly in front of a group. There's also, I'll take a wad of €1,000 and pass it around the room. We do embodied exercises.
And why would you do that?
Why?
Mm-hmm.
To bring out people's responses to money. So if I take €1,000 and pass it around the room in cash, right? Some people they're like holding it. Some people are, oh my God, this is so dangerous. I can't believe you're doing this. What if someone steals it? Some people are like pretending to steal it as a joke. Some people don't want to hold it and they give it to the next person really quickly. So like all the patterns come out.
Beautiful example.
Just simple thing, right? So sometimes I ask to be paid in cash and, cuts down the taxes as well. So yeah, that's what's one thing that we do. There's many examples. Like if I take out a €10 note and set fire to it, some people will be like, oh my God, that's disgusting. That's such a waste. And other people are like, who do you think you are? Like all these stories come out.
Mm-hmm.
Just ask people, what is money? Money's freedom, money's life, money's status, money's nothing, money's bad. There's all sorts of things. So there's a whole body of this is just one of the 100 things I teach my mentees in terms of business, because there's a psychological side and there's a practical, how to make a sales website. There's an external side as well.
And then, if I understand correctly, then the goal is not to change their relationship to money through talking and arguments, but through their body and how they physically respond to it.
Yeah, so again, we bring awareness to patterns and then we train new patterns. We practice something else, like practice being relaxed while holding money instead of passing it on to the next person. Like, here's €1,000, hold it, breathe. Yeah, or I'll say to the group, ask me for money. And the first person that asks me for money, I give €50 to. And then all the patterns come out, and then someone else does, and we practice it. And then, usually we move to Monopoly money because I haven't got so many €50. But it's like there's ways to practice those things in the body, to receive the Monopoly money and to breathe, and then we can calibrate it, we can play with it. So like anything, and that this could be sex, this could be any power, this could be any issue. Like Germans really struggle with power, right? So that's another one we play with. And then like sexuality, some people that's the thing they've got to own, not disembodied. So again, calibrated ways. So money is just a triggering thing for a lot of people, particularly a lot of counterculture people. They're not very good with it.
Yeah, boundaries is the other one.
Boundaries is huge. We've got a no pose. People can look that up on YouTube. We've got boundaries. I've done a lot of work with that. That's a really big one for so many people, pleaser clients. So big.
And I love that. Recently, someone on the podcast said that boundaries is actually the biggest problem that organizations have nowadays. That that employees don't learn to protect their boundaries. Our boundaries are not respected, or we are not, good in setting them. And that's why so many burn out and don't have these, the necessary conversations even.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't have boundaries, again, that's an embodied capacity. It's not a theoretical thing. Everyone can say the word no, but they can't embody it when they need to. People who don't embody boundaries, they will always become burnt out and effectively abused. So it's totally essential.
How do we embody boundaries?
Well, there's an embodiment to it, right? Like if somebody's got floppy arms and they're very open and passive, that's, not there. Certain cultures have it better than others, and certain, women tend to be worse than men, though less so in Germany and Holland. And then we can give them a practice. We can give them a pose. You could do a chaturanga every day. It's a yoga pose. That's a boundary. It's a push. You could do a bench press if you're into the gym. You could do we have a no pose that you can find on the internet that we give people just as a little 1 or 2 minute practice, and they can really start to find that edge in themselves. And as a coach, I'll work with them. There's lots of video of me coaching people around pushing their boundary. I'm pushing their edge physically.
Beautiful. And then it's so consistent with the way you described your practice and provoking and making the space a little bit more unsafe, because otherwise you cannot practice them.
Because they practice boundaries. Mm-hmm. And I'll do all sorts of things. I'll walk around and try and touch people on the nose, or, depending on the group, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, I'll swing a sword at them if they're advanced, but, there's different levels of training, right? If I'm working with abused children or vulnerable people, it's a very different level of intensity, right? Yeah. So, but, I assume robustness. I don't assume that people are broken. I assume that people are robust adults and they can handle a bit of play. So
beautiful. Thank you.
No worries. I mean, there's lots of stuff online if people want to look it up. It's much easier to show than to tell. So it's
I do see that the podcast has some limitations, but there's a video and
great.
Well, thank you. We've spoken for an hour. Is there anything that you would have liked to mention or draw our attention towards that we haven't touched upon?
Let's have a look. We've looked at embodied awareness, state regulation, empathy, and leadership, which are kind of the 4 quadrants of embodied intelligence. So I think that's a pretty good overview for people. Talk about trauma a little bit, cultural stuff a little bit. I guess a pretty good overview. I mean, this stuff's in the tasting rather than the talking, but it's a pretty good overview, I think.
Can I ask a last question, since you mentioned trauma?
All good.
And I mean, trauma-informed facilitation is an entire different arm. Last week, I spoke to Adam, and we spoke about the sitting in a circle and how many facilitators love sitting in a circle. He mentioned that he stopped doing that because it can trigger participants in the sense that it reminds them of this therapy sessions.
Who was this? Who said that?
A facilitator.
I mean, he gets to sit into triangle, that screws with the hippies. That really messes them up. Get them to sit in a square. People hate it. I mean, it depends what the structure you get people to sit in. Obviously, has resonances, right? But people can be triggered by anything. Like I'm wearing a pink T-shirt today. Well, actually, salmon. Technically, I think that color's called. Let's say someone abused you in a salmon-colored T-shirt, you would find me triggering, right? Anything could be triggering. Yeah, so I don't know if sitting in circles is going to particularly trigger people, but it may or may not be a skillful environment to create.
And this was actually my question. So what would be for you the most maybe impactful way of sitting? And I guess it depends.
I change it every 10 minutes. I'll move positions. We'll lie on the floor. We'll stand up and walk around. We'll sit in a circle. We'll sit in a classroom format, build more authority, more hierarchy. Then we'll reduce the hierarchy by making a circle, be outside in the forest, working in the woods and the mountains, get people hugging trees, whatever, man. Like there's so many possibilities. It's not like the way.
Okay. So there's no particular allergy against sitting in a circle without
for some things, right? If you want like more equity and you want everyone to see each other. I mean, I don't really like narcissistic circles of sharing death where people just go around and spend ages telling you about their feelings. That's boring. But I don't really see the point in that. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely a place for a circle.
Now I have one more question.
God.
And I'm in awe by the clarity of your expression, what's okay and what's not, and what's
I've
just annoying.
About it a lot. It's 20 years of thinking about it. Like I make a lot of jokes, but I've really thought about this topic.
Yes, and I totally can hear that. And I wonder, it's so easy to fall into the trap. We sit in a circle and then one person starts with speaking about their feelings, and it can slide into this therapy session.
I think in America, the default is emotional confession as a culture.
So how do you prevent that? Or if it happens, what is your strategy?
I am the Führer. So if I'm in charge, I assert authority. And I first of all, I explain up Führer, by the way, for listeners, means leader. I explain up front that this isn't a therapy session, and I don't care that much about people's feelings, and they're there to learn and not to express themselves, and no one's paid for their opinion, and what I expect from them is for them to learn, and that might mean contributing in a group, it might mean being quiet, and I'm okay with that. And yeah, I came from a sort of martial arts sensei background, so it's a very different kind of assumption. And I'm nowhere near as rigorous as my senseis were in terms of aikido, for example. They have a much more authoritarian than I am. But yeah, I think asserting authority is a totally valid thing. People have come to learn from you, not from random people who want to speak. Mm-hmm. I mean, if they keep at it, I'll just throw them out eventually.
And then you would interrupt them and say...
Yeah, everything. Shout over them. Put my hand over their mouth, whatever. It's no one's paid for that. No one cares. People want to hear the teacher. And yeah, some sharing in the group can be helpful. It's useful to harvest learning, and maybe there's a different perspective that's helpful and get a woman's perspective or a different cultural perspective. But endless sharing about people's feelings doesn't help. Doesn't do anything. It's not learning. It's just indulgent.
Yes, it depends on the context and the group, and
yeah, everything depends, right? So there are times when we'll do an hour sharing. This is not. There's times and I'll say, right, let's go around, everyone share for 3 minutes. It takes an hour to go around. We time people so it's fair. There might be a whole thing.
Yeah. I was just curious. And I what I hear is setting the ground rules up front and then really
This is the
enforcing
deal,
them.
guys. This is an educational environment. I'm going to facilitate. This is here's what I expect from you guys. And, we're not doing group therapy, which is fine, but something different.
Yeah. One person once laughed and said, after I explained that, all it takes is just making it clear, the instructions. And she was like, true. I cannot imagine that ever someone complained about a facilitator to be too clear.
Yeah. Clarity, like operational language. Tell people exactly what you want them to do.
Yeah.
Don't tell them to hold space and extend energy. Tell them these are the specifics, right? Like, especially working with translators and stuff, it's really necessary.
Oh, yeah. That's an entire different level, and we won't touch it because I have one eye on the clock.
No
and you have
I'm just about to go interview someone for my podcast, and they're very intense guests, so I need to prepare myself. It's going to be they've translated books that have been banned by Amazon. They're pretty full on, so
oh wow,
going to get ready for them. It's going to be a good intellectual sparring match.
Wonderful. I wish you fun. So,
for me, that is intellectual combat, massively fun. Looking forward to it. Yeah, good.
Thank you so much for spending this hour with me.
No worries. Good questions. Can I tell people where to find my stuff?
Please.
Embodimentunlimited.com. Lots of free resources there, particularly for facilitators. There's a whole bunch of stuff based around many of the themes we said. Mark Walsh, Walsh on Instagram. If you prefer YouTube, you can see like these no poses and some of these things we've done. And it's the Embodiment podcast if you like podcasts, which you probably do if you're listening to this. So that is all the places on books, everything, Tinder, whatever. It's all out there. So lots of ways to find me online.
Just imagining your Tinder profile with all
Actually, I don't have one anymore. I've been snaffled. I don't have one anymore, I don't think, unless it's still active. It's pretty fun, though, if anyone's bumped into it. Actually, my Tinder profile was copied by 10% of the men in Moscow because it was so good. It was a series of reviews, like TripAdvisor reviews, but by women. So I had joke TripAdvisor reviews about me as a lover, and that was my profile back in the day before I settled down. So many years ago. There we go. I think it's a good place to end it. Tinder profile tips.
Salvador. And everything will be in the show notes. Thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you so much.
It was fun.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thank you for staying tuned and for listening until the very end. I hope that you found the inspiration and the wisdom that you are looking for. And I hope that you will subscribe to the show so that you never miss any of the interviews with another inspiring facilitator from across the world. I'm devoted to continue this podcast and to deliver weekly an episode that maintains the quality that you expect and you deserve. And if you would like to help me to maintain this quality and to keep the podcast free, please help us. Visit workshops.work/support to make a small donation to keep the podcast free. Thank you so much. I hope to be in your ears next week.